There's a story I need to tell. It begins in Genesis, in a moment when God pronounced judgment on humanity. In Genesis 3 verse 17, God said to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life." Farming was humanity's first punishment. The soil would be stubborn. The work would be endless. Breaking even would feel like winning, and going broke would feel inevitable. For thousands of years, farmers have lived this curse. They've planted in faith and harvested in uncertainty. They've worked themselves to exhaustion for margins so thin you could see through them. They've watched input costs rise while commodity prices fell. They've absorbed losses that larger economies simply pass down to them like a stone rolling downhill. This is the reality of farmers throughout the world. But then something miraculous happened to American farmers. Or so we were told. A man named Donald Trump came to rural America with a promise. He spoke to farmers at rallies with the certainty of a prophet. "I will fix your trade deals," he said. "I will bring back your markets. China will pay. Mexico will pay. Everyone will respect American agriculture again." Farmers believed him. They voted for him. They wore his red hat to church. They put his signs in their fields. He won, and farmers waited. This was their moment. Their savior had arrived. Then came the tariffs. Trump called them Liberation Day tariffs, not as a negotiating tool, but as a sledgehammer. China, America's largest buyer of soybeans, stopped buying. According to USDA data, the US exports more than 40% of its soybean production globally. When that market closed, prices collapsed. A bushel of soybeans that sold for $14.20 in 2022 have projections down to $11 per bushel by 2025. But here's the cruelty of the tariffs. Farmers don't just lose on the selling side. When tariffs increased on steel and aluminum, the cost of equipment and machinery rose. When tariffs hit fertilizer imports, farmers paid more for seeds. When transportation and logistics costs increased, those costs didn't stay with shipping companies. They got passed down to the farmer. According to the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, soybean input costs are already 16% higher than they were in 2020. With the new tariffs, those costs climbed further. The farmer is trapped in the middle. Prices fall, costs rise. There's nowhere left to squeeze. The president said, "This is temporary. Trust me." But farmers couldn't wait. Banks were calling. Equipment sat idle. Some took their own lives. Despair became arithmetic. Farm production expenses are estimated to reach $467.4 billion in 2025, according to the Agriculture Department, up $12 billion from the prior year. Farm bankruptcies rose to the highest level since 2021. The man who promised to save them offered a plan. Subsidy checks totaling $10 to $15 billion, announced in October 2025. But the checks haven't arrived. A federal government shutdown, for which he is responsible, delayed disbursement. Legislative hurdles stalled the process. Farmers waited for relief that remained promised but unpaid. Earlier USDA disaster assistance programs provided some temporary help, but it wasn't enough. What farmers got was a promise of a lifeline, not an actual lifeline. They got announcements while their debt accumulated. The humiliation was complete. But here's what the farmers didn't know while they were losing everything. On September 24, 2025, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced a $20 billion bailout for Argentina. According to reports in major Argentine media outlets, this wasn't a straightforward economic decision. Reportedly, hedge fund billionaire Rob Citrone, a personal friend and former colleague of Bessent, had bet massive amounts of money that Argentina's new president, Javier Milei, would turn the country's economy around under his deregulation and austerity program. Hundreds of millions invested in Argentine debt and equity. It was supposed to work. It didn't. When Argentina's economy worsened instead, Citrone's hedge fund began bleeding money. So Citrone reached out to his friend at Treasury. And his friend, who manages the entire United States Treasury, delivered $20 billion from American taxpayers to rescue one hedge fund manager's failed bets. It's an illustration of how the system works. When you're wealthy and connected, government resources flow toward you. When you're a farmer, you are promised subsidy checks that never show up. Here's where the God's curse gets sharpened. The moment that $20 billion hit Argentina's accounts, something shifted.
Casta es de mi apetito. Por eso todo el tiempo. sus ojos ven.
The Argentine government, suddenly flush with American cash, lifted their export tariffs on grain. Suddenly, they could sell cheap. Suddenly, they were competitive. And do you know who wanted to buy Argentine soybeans? China, the same country that stopped buying American soybeans, the same country that destroyed our farmers because of Trump's tariffs. Now they had a new supplier, courtesy of American taxpayers. In one transaction, the United States government had simultaneously bailed out a hedge fund manager's failed investments, strengthened the competitor to American farmers, deepened the very export crisis that tariffs were supposed to solve. Did Trump deliberately engineer this to destroy soybean farmers? Probably not. The administration isn't competent enough for that level of conspiracy, but that's almost worse, isn't it? It means while the president was making deals to benefit his wealthy friends, while Treasury officials were funneling public money to hedge funds, while billionaires were cashing in on insider information, nobody was thinking about Nebraska. Nobody was thinking about Iowa. Nobody was thinking about the farmers whose support got this man elected. Nobody was thinking about the structural reality that when you have money and connections, the government exists to help you. When you're a farmer struggling to pay for fertilizer, you only get a promise of temporary relief. One farmer described the situation perfectly. We bailed out Argentina yesterday, and in return, they sold a bunch of soybeans to China. Remember Genesis? Remember the curse of toil? God said the ground would be cursed, that farmers would struggle all their days. That sweat and suffering were baked into the work itself. That curse is real. It's structural. It's ancient. Farmers have lived it for millennia. But Trump, he's not just fulfilling that ancient curse. No, he's layering a new one on top of it. A curse that says, the system exists not to help you, but to extract value from you and pass it upward to those with power. He's serving a different God, a newer God, a God with no patience for soil or seasons or the actual work of growing food. His God is money, specifically other people's money, taxpayer money. The money that was supposed to invest in rural infrastructure, that was supposed to actually negotiate fair trade deals, that was supposed to solve the problem he created. Instead, it went to a hedge fund manager in New York who needed rescuing. The American farmer was promised salvation. What they got was a demonstration of whose interests actually matter in this administration and whose interests don't. Farms that have been in families for generations are being auctioned off. Young people are leaving agriculture because they've watched what it takes to survive. Rural main streets are emptying. The family farm isn't struggling, it's dying. Meanwhile, hedge fund managers are richer. Treasury officials sleep well, and the president keeps winning. This isn't the ancient curse anymore. This is deliberate extraction. This is a system designed so that when prices fall, farmers lose. When input costs rise, farmers absorb it. When government resources get deployed, they go to billionaires, not to the people who actually grow your food. Farmers didn't lose because of weather or bad luck. They lost because the game was rigged from the start. They lost because they trusted a guy who promised his tariffs will solve all their problems. So when people talk about Trump carrying out God's plan for farmers, they're not wrong. If God's plan was to deepen the curse, then yes. If God's plan was to prove that farmers exist to be squeezed by larger economic forces, then yes. If God's plan was to show that elections don't matter if you're a rural American without access to Treasury officials, then yes. If God's plan was to demonstrate that government resources flow upward to the wealthy while hardworking people get temporary relief that never quite lasts, then yes. God's plan is alive and well. The soybeans aren't selling. The land is being auctioned off. The hope is gone. But the bailouts keep flowing to those who know the right people. That's not prophecy. That's just Trump's America.